Welcome to Chapter 15 on the autonomic nervous system and the last and final chapter in this course series this semester. So as always, we have our learning objectives that you want to take a look at when you finish studying the material and make sure you can address all of those. So we've learned a lot about the nervous system. This last unit has had a lot of information on nervous system. And some of this is going to be review and some of this is going to be new. So we tie it all together here. So the nervous system can be divided into two functional parts. The somatic nervous system, which is what you did with muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which is what we're going to be focusing on mostly in this lecture. The somatic nervous system was associated with voluntary responses through skeletal muscle, although some of it happens without you really thinking about it. You don't think about breathing, even though the diaphragm is composed mostly of skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system controls cardiac and smooth muscle, which are two of our involuntary muscles, as well as glandular tissue, and is related to homeostasis. So what are some of the differences between these two, the autonomic and the somatic nervous system? Both of them had motor fibers, but they differ in the effectors, the effector pathway or the efferent pathways, and the ganglia, and the target organ responses to different neurotransmitters. So maybe a nice summary chart to give you an idea of how all of this stuff from this last unit on nervous system was to get put together. So looking down the bottom left-hand corner is where this flow chart starts, and it's talking about the receptors. So your special sensory receptors like smell and taste and vision, balance and hearing, which was the focus of the last chapter. The visceral sensory organs, which are what we have in our internal organs. So when you feel that pain in your side, or you have an upset stomach, or your bladder feels full, all those kinds of things are sensations of in the visceral organs. And then the somatic sensory receptors were, of course, associated with the skeletal muscles, joints, and skin. So those were the receptors they had to go through the peripheral nervous system, go in the peripheral nervous system to get to the central nervous system. And in the central nervous system, it was integrated, processed, and coordinated to determine what the motor command was going to be. And then going down the other side, you see the emotor command. If it was a muscle, then it was on the somatic nervous system, and that controlled our skeletal muscles. But if we had motor commands that went to the autonomic nervous system, we had the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division, which is what we're talking about today. And this is going to be our smooth muscle, our cardiac muscle, and our glands. So the autonomic nervous system is going to regulate many of the internal organs through a balance of two separate divisions. The ANS is instrumental in homeostatic mechanism in the body, along with the endocrine system, which is your first topic in the second half of this course. The two divisions of the autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic is associated with the idea of fight or flight. So you hear that in everyday language. That just means, are you going to stand your ground in a situation, or are you going to flee? And the parasympathetic side is about preparing your body for rest, and they call it rest and digest. It's for preparing your body for resting and digestion, production of urine, those kinds of things. Homeostasis, as you remember, is a balance. It's a balance in this case between these two systems. At each target effector, there is dual innervation. So you have both parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation, and that's going to determine the activity at that particular target, like the heart or the digestive system or the bladder, right? So to give you an example, the heart receives connections from both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. One's going to cause the heart rate to increase, and the other one's going to cause the heart rate to decrease. So this is taking a look at the somatic at the top and the sympathetic and parasympathetic division at the bottom, the neurons associated with that. So if you take a look at the one at the top, this was again back at chapter 9 when we talked about the somatic nervous system, where we had the central nervous system, we had a myelinated axon. The electrical signal ran down the myelinated axon, caused the release of acetylcholine. The acetylcholine uh, uh, caused the skeletal muscle ultimately to contract, and so the acetylcholine was considered stimulatory on that particular muscle. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we're looking at the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So looking over at the left-hand side of our chart here on the bottom half. When we're in the central nervous system and we're talking about the sympathetic division, you have what's called the preganglionic myelinated axon, which is going to release acetylcholine at the ganglion onto the postganglionic non-myelinated axon, and that's going to cause the release of norepinephrine onto smooth muscles, glands, and cardiac muscle. And depending on whether it is a stimulatory or inhibitory receptor will depend on our response. Looking at the parasympathetic division, again, we're going to have a preganglionic myelinated axon, which is going to release acetylcholine at the ganglion, which is going to cause the release of acetylcholine at the target. And again, it's going to depend on whether it is what type of receptor we have as to whether it is stimulatory or inhibitory. So a little bit different thing going on here when we're talking about what's happening in this parasympathetic and sympathetic side to our autonomic nervous system. Somatic division again, one neuron to the effector. The cell body was located in the central nervous system. It had a myelinated axon that ran from the spinal cord or the cranial nerve directly to the skeletal muscle. It was pretty straightforward. That's what we looked at in chapter 9. The autonomic division has two neurons from the central nervous system to the effector. So we only had one in muscle. We had one that came right out and went right to the muscle. Now we're going to have two, and they're going to be separated by a ganglion, right? Which is remember, a ganglion is a whole mass of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So you're going to have the neuron that's before that called the preganglionic. So its cell body is going to be in the central nervous system, and then it's going to have a preganglionid myelinated axon that's going to extend to the actual ganglion itself. Then you're going to have the postganglionic neuron that's after that. Its cell body is going to be located outside of the central nervous system in the peripheral, and it's going to form a synapse in that ganglion with the postganglionic axon that's going to extend out to the effector organ. So go back to the picture on the previous page, and that's what it was showing you. So the synapses of the autonomic system are going to be classified as cholinergic, which means that they're going to release acetylcholine, or adrenergic, which means they release norepinephrine. The term cholinergic and adrenergic refer not only to the signaling molecule, the neurotransmitter itself that's released, but also to the class of receptors to which they bind. A little bit about cholinergic receptors. The cholinergic system is going to include two classes of receptors, and both types are going to bind to acetylcholine. A nicotinic receptor, which is stimulatory in its effect on the target cell, or a muscarinic receptor, which is either inhibitory or excitatory, depending on the receptor type at the target organ. Acetylcholine, for example, to cardiac muscle cells actually slows the heart rate. We saw acetylcholine in the skeletal muscle, and it sped up the process, right? It was stimulatory. Acetylcholine at the heart with a muscarinic receptor is going to be inhibitory. When we look at that at the intestinal smooth muscle cells, it's actually excitatory. So again, it's always going to depend on, we look at the receptor, we look at the neurotransmitter, we look at the receptor type, all sorts of things to determine if it's excitatory or inhibitory. With our adrenergic receptors, this has two types of receptors as well. They are named alpha adrenergic receptor or the beta adrenergic receptor. And each type has subtypes, and the effects depend on which subtype of receptor dominates on that target organ. So it's not as clear cut as it was with our muscles. Autonomic tone. So we talked a little bit about muscle tone, and that was the idea that the muscles are always in the partially activated state so that they're not just flaccid and like a noodle, right? So we have the same thing going on in the autonomic nervous system. So organ systems are a balance between input from our sympathetic and our parasympathetic divisions. And for each organ system, there may be more of the sympathetic or more of the parasympathetic, what they call tendency to be in the resting state. That's known as the autonomic tone. So in other words, which one has more control at any given moment? At each target effector, you have dual innervation. That's going to determine the activity. So, for example, as I've said before, the heart receives connections from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. One is going to cause the heart rate to increase, and the other is going to cause the heart rate to decrease. The balance of homeostasis is attributable to the competing inputs from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, again, what we refer to as dual innervation. So those two arms of the autonomic nervous system that I've been talking about, let's give them a little bit more detail here. Parasympathetic division is going to preserve or promote maintenance functions, and it conserves energy. Sympathetic is going to mobilize the body during activity. I think about them like the brakes and the accelerator. So the parasympathetic is what slows things down for the most part, and the sympathetic division is what speeds systems up for the most part. Now let's talk about the for the most part part. All right. So let's just talk about sympathetic. Sympathetic is going to speed most body systems up. All right. The exception to that is going to be the urinary system, the digestive system, and the reproductive system. Those three systems are slowed down when the sympathetic division is activated, and it's vice versa for parasympathetic. In the parasympathetic system is in control, then digestive, urinary, and reproductive are going to speed up. So I want you to think about the logic of this for just a minute. Sympathetic is what goes into play when you are scared or excited, or you've all had the experience before where your sympathetic system takes over, nervous system takes over, and your heart starts to race and all that sort of stuff, right? When you're in sympathetic activation, this is a terrible time for your body to use energy to digest, to make urine, or to worry about reproduction. And so those three systems slow down, and the energy that they would normally use is shunted to the heart and the skeletal muscles and all of the things that need to prepare you for an emergency. The same thing is true conversely with parasympathetic. And you are relaxing and rejuvenating yourself. This is a terrible time for these systems to not be doing their job. This is the perfect time for these systems to be doing their job. So when you're in rest and repose or parasympathetic activation, the majority of the systems are slowed down. Heart rate slows down, all of those other things in your body slow down, except for digestive, urinary, and reproduction. They all speed up. So this is looking at target organs or systems, what I was just talking about in a way, and showing you the parasympathetic effects versus the sympathetic effects, and what happens. Let's just look at the eye, the iris of the eye. When you are in parasympathetic activation, in other words, you're relaxed, you're just sitting there, the pupils constrict down. But if you are scared, you have an emergency, the sympathetic effects are going to kick in and the pupils are going to dilate. Why? You need to get more light in your eyes. You need to be able to see. Okay? Let's look at the erector pili muscles, for example. Another one. No effect in parasympathetic. When you're relaxed and watching TV, there's no effect to the erector pili muscles. But if you get scared, sometimes you get goosebumps, right? And that's because of the erector pili muscles. The heart in parasympathetic, it slows down. You're in sympathetic, it increases both in rate and force and contraction. All right. So, just think about each organ or each system and say, okay, in the event of an emergency, what would you expect for this system to be doing? And that'll give you your sympathetic answer. And in the in the event of me being completely relaxed, what would I expect for this system to be doing? And again, the three systems that are the opposite are digestive, urinary, and reproductive. So a little bit about the parasympathetic division. It conserves body energy during your maintenance activities. It promotes digestion and defecation, production of urine, all those kinds of things. Also, again, known as rest and digest or rest and repose. So some examples, if you're relaxing after a meal, your blood pressure starts to go down, your heart rate goes down, your respiratory rates go down. You're just, calm and quiet. But you have an increased gastrointestinal activity because now is a great time for your body to use energy to digest. The sympathetic division is going to control and mobilize body during activity, also again known as fight or flight. It can be activated by exercise, excitement, emergency, or embarrassment. So the 4 E's is what we always call it. You experience an increase in your heart rate, dry mouth, cold, sweaty skin, dilated pupils. So think about what happens anytime you get really scared. Think about physiologically what happens to your body. During heavy exercise, you also activate your sympathetic division. This increases the blood supply to the skeletal muscles in the heart. It dilates the bronchioles to allow more oxygen in so you can get more air and more oxygen to your muscles. And it causes the liver to release glucose to provide the energy that your skeletal muscles need. So what's controlling all of this? Um, the hypothalamus is the control center for many of the homeostatic mechanisms that I've been talking about. It regulates both the autonomic function and endocrine that we're going to see again next semester. It receives input from the cerebral structures and projects those to the brainstem and to the spinal cord structures. It regulates the balance of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic input to the organ system in the body. The main pathways for this are the medial forebrain bundle and the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. And they're showing you that in this picture. I'm not as concerned about you knowing the names of the pathway. What I do want you to really know is that the hypothalamus is the control center for this. The amygdala is a group of nuclei in the medial region of the temporal lobe that is part of the limbic lobe. And so we always think about the limbic lobe as the emotional part of your brain, the emotional lobe of your brain. So it's responsible for your emotional responses that you have, but it also has a lot to do with memory function. The limbic lobe has a strong connection to the hypothalamus, and it influences a state of activity based on your emotional state. So, for example, if you're anxious or you're scared, the amygdala will send signals to the hypothalamus that will stimulate the sympathetic fight or flight response that we've been talking about. So you can see where the amygdala is. It's very, very deep in the brain. It's purple, the lighter purple of the two. The medulla also contains nuclei called the cardiovascular center. This is going to control smooth and cardiac muscle of the cardiovascular system through its autonomic connections, and it also controls the respiratory rate. So you'll learn more about the cardiovascular and the respiratory centers in Bio 211. All right, this is the end. This is the end of the lecture series for the first semester of Bio 210. You are now ready to move on to Bio 211. I have enjoyed being your instructor for this course. I wish you the very best in your academic career and your future career in healthcare.